Attention, attention please. Stand by for another episode of
When Humanists Attack.
Hi, this is Roger Smith for When Humanists Attack. And these programs are a project of a non-profit religious organization under the name The Humanist Being, registered in the state of Vermont. And on this installment of When Humanists Attack, I'm very excited to have as our guest H.J. Evans. He introduced himself to me as Lee Evans. He is a journalist and a father of two, lives in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. He's the author of the book, Leaving the Tower, Why Jehovah's Witnesses Are Wrong About Just About Everything. He's a former JW. He didn't include a great deal of his own story in the book. He says his story is pretty typical among the witnesses growing up within faith and within the organization, entering adulthood among them to the point of marrying and becoming a father, and only then starting to be bothered by questions about it all, questions and questioning that ultimately led him to withdraw from the faith at great cost to the life he had built. Questioning that clearly also motivated the writing of this book. In the introduction to Leaving the Tower, he says, this isn't an autobiography. This book is meant to show you that you're not crazy, that you're not alone. You're right to question things that you've been taught. And what's more, you're on the right track. Keep it up. You know, this book, he says, is supposed to make you question things that you thought were true. Above all, it's supposed to make you realize one important, vital truth that we could all stand to learn. You can always be wrong. And being wrong isn't bad. Being wrong is the first step to growth. Now, as a humanist, I say a great big amen to that. I say whoopee to that, you know, from the standpoint of the humanist values of critical thinking and ethical development. Mr. Evans, my hat is off to you. You have achieved something really extraordinary. Being wrong is the first step to growth. Being wrong and humble enough to admit it, right? To stand for truth. So welcome, H.J. Evans. Let's talk about it all. Let's start early on, if you will. I mean, I imagine.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's a delight. Now, your early years, I'm thinking, must, from the present standpoint, feel to you like a time of intense indoctrination.
Yeah.
How did it work?
My mother started bringing us into the Jehovah's Witnesses right around the time I was maybe like 1 or 2 or 3 years old. She actually got baptized as a Jehovah Witness, which is when you formally join the faith, when I was 3 years old. I don't remember a life before the witnesses. I know that shortly after that, my mom and dad split up because my mom had made it clear that she wasn't interested in my dad if he didn't want to be a witness. And my dad understood that he wasn't welcome amongst the witnesses. He tried, but they didn't want him. They only wanted my mom. So from a very young age, that was all I was around.
So wait, he exited the scene. Did he keep up a relationship with you?
He did his best. He really tried. He's a good man. He really tried to stay in the picture. But one of the things that happens is witnesses will try and separate families. So they'll try and say, look, this person is not one of Jehovah's Witnesses, so you shouldn't be spending any time with them. You shouldn't be around them. You shouldn't be doing stuff with them. Don't waste your time with that person. So that's kind of what happened.
Mixed marriages can't survive, I imagine.
Exactly. And that's kind of what happened with my dad, is that they kind of told me, you know, don't spend time with your dad. Don't want to spend time with your dad. And he, to his credit, stuck in there. You know, he just sort of bided his time, you know, did what he could. A lot of the best lessons in my life that I learned from him. So I'm always grateful that he did that. But it was a really sort of tricky thing. And that happens with a lot of people who grow up as witnesses, that their families get separated somehow and they don't know anything else but how to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Mhm.
My earliest memories are of sitting in the meetings, and the meetings, that the way that witnesses will do these meetings, they're religious sort of church gatherings, but they would have 3 of them a week. 2 of them would be for about 2 hours, and
Mm.
1 of them would be for 1 hour. Now
Mhm.
imagine you're a 3, 4, 5-year-old little boy, you're
Right.
antsy, a lot,
But you've
and
been
this.
baptized, so you belong to them.
Now I wasn't baptized yet. They
Okay.
don't, they make a big show of not baptizing children. They're very proud of themselves that they don't baptize babies. And
Mhm.
we'll circle back to that.
Okay.
Because it's important to note what baptism like means to them. Those are some of my earliest memories, is just sitting there. And one of the things that ends up happening is that kids who misbehave, especially in the 80s and 90s, will get dragged into the back and hit a lot.
Yes, you
Spanked.
use the phrase in your book, the spanking room.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
Ugh.
That there's actually a book out there from a former Jehovah Witness called The Spanking Room. And I saw that and I'm like, that is apropos, because that is
Oy.
exactly what that room was. That there was always a place where they would take the kids and just my older brother, excuse me, was only associating with the witnesses for about 6 months before my mom and my dad separated, and then he went with my dad. And he still clearly remembers the spanking room. Like
Yeah.
40 years later, he remembers the spankings that he got at Jehovah's Witnesses. When you're very small, they tell you, look, this is important. You need to pay attention, or else you will die.
Mm.
Because their belief system is based on Armageddon will come at any moment, any second. Armageddon is going to come. And if you are not doing everything that you can, you will die.
Yeah. And I guess
So,
that there's no protecting the babies.
yeah, there's no protecting it from that concept,
Yeah.
because what they do is they mix the children in with the adults during meetings,
Mhm.
so that the same stuff that they're considering, that has pictures of, the destruction of the world and of meteors and stones hitting people and killing them, is the same stuff you see as a kid. So they're exposing kids to this really apocalyptic imagery very young, and it
Yeah,
kind
you
of messes
spoke
with their
about the
head.
book of Bible stories.
The Witnesses made a kind of propagandist book called Mankind's Search for God, the one book that just about every witness child of a certain age remembers, where they explained why every single religion is wrong except them. And one of the things that they did in the very beginning of the book is a picture of an Aztec sacrifice where they rip the heart out of a person who is like sliced open, and rivers of blood coming out. This is real. I remember paging through it and just paging through, oh, this is a cool new book. And then I paged through it and I almost like threw up. It's that graphic. And bear in mind, I'm like 9 years old. The most graphic thing to this thing that I'd ever seen was like G.I. Joe. And suddenly I'm being greeted with this very horrifying imagery. And they do
Fire and
this
brimstone.
yes, and they do this with a lot of kids because they want kids to be scared. They want them to understand the stakes, that this is what happens. This is what will happen to you if you leave. Think of how the terror, woo, do you really want to be scared like this? So I assumed, yep, that's what I'm supposed to do. So I didn't pay attention in school. I didn't care about school because school's not important. I didn't have friends who were, kids who were for school friends. I kind of made sure to keep them at arm's length.
School
So
was
that,
considered just part of the corrupting outside world.
yeah, and that's not it wasn't the most important thing. If you're a witness, the
Mhm.
most important thing is, witness stuff. But I found a lot of comfort in the witnesses because I was a very good public speaker. Since the age of 6, I was doing public speaking, and like
Aha.
in front of sometimes in front of 100 people. I did one in front of like 1,200 people when I was in my late teens.
Mm.
It was just, and it was a rush and it was fun, and you couldn't do the public speaking unless you did all the other stuff.
Were you preaching?
Yeah, basically, they would assign you like a Bible book or a little Bible reading or something like that. Like, for example, they would say, okay, this week's reading, and this is everybody in the country, everybody in the world who is a Jehovah Witness would be assigned the same Bible topic. So they'd be like,
Uniformity.
okay, uniformity. Your reading this week is Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Me, as a little 7 or 8 year old, would get up there, do a little introduction about the reading, then read a little bit, and then do a kind of conclusion of, yes, so this is what we get out of the reading. And then it was a 5-minute long thing. And then I'd get down and everybody, clap. And I was always so proud of myself. And everybody at that point would be like, oh, you did such a good job. Good job. Good job.
Oh,
And
yeah.
for a kid who was being hit with a lot of sticks, that was the carrot. That was the thing that kept me that was the thing that kept me going.
Were you also doing the sort of door-to-door, like retail religion stuff? No?
Absolutely, yes. And some kids hated it. I loved it.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, I loved going door to door because you get to meet so many different people, and you'd get to take walks with people, and you'd be walking around the block knocking on every door, and hi, my name is Lee, we're talking about blah blah blah, and it was fun because you get to meet, like, I love people and I love getting to know them, so I enjoyed it. Now, most witness kids, I was a weird one. Most witness kids hated going door to door for obvious reasons, because going door to door stinks, man. Like, I know one person who, they were canvassing for a political candidate, and they were doing it for about like 2 doors, and then they had a panic attack and they couldn't do it anymore because it reminded them too much of what it was like preaching door to door. Like, that it really affects a lot of people, and they make kids do it very young. I was 5 years old the first time I did a little presentation at the door. Quick story: one time, I'm doing a presentation, and I'm presenting my little magazines, and I may be 11 years old or so. Then all of a sudden, I feel a little wet thud on my shoulder, and I look over, and a bird had taken a dump on my shoulder. And I'm like, so anyways, and I continued doing my little presentation. So, like, that sort of weird stuff, those are the sort of weird things that would happen,
Unperturbed. I would say you were ready for Armageddon if you dealt with that,
Exactly. If you've had a bird take a dump on your shoulder, you can handle pretty much anything. You're fine. You're fine.
So it sounds like you're saying that at that age, you weren't racked by cognitive dissonance, or,
Nope.
You were with the program, I suppose.
Yeah. And the reason why I liked it is because they had a veneer of scientific belief. We've done the research, and here's the results of our research. And that appealed to me because, for me, I was like, yeah, I was a very logical thinker. And I was like, well, if you can logically prove something, it must be true, without knowing that the majority of the information I was being fed was incorrect.
Yeah.
And they also kind of set it up so that they go, look, we are the only ones that provide true information, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. When you're a very small child, you don't have a way of knowing whether or not this is true. You don't have a way of knowing whether or not somebody's feeding you a lie. That's kind of how they catch a lot of kids. And then by the time that they start hitting 18, 19, 20, and their brains start getting more formed, it's too late. They're already trapped. I got baptized when I was 12 years old. I was 12 years old. And when you get baptized, that is when you formally join the church. From that point on, if you decide to leave or get kicked out, you will be shunned. That's why they make a big deal out of, we don't baptize kids, because they're comparing their baptism to like a Catholic or Lutheran baptism or any other type of church. Whereas those baptisms are more like the first rite. It's just, oh yeah, God loves you. Here you go. Here's a little, here, I'll splash some water on your face. Whereas this is like, This is like you signing a lifelong contract at the age of 12, a lifelong contract of servitude.
Right. All the consequences are front loaded,
Exactly. And you have no way of knowing this when you're very small. So as you get a little bit older, that's when doubts start sort of creeping in. That's when you start maybe starting to question things. What happened is, as I got older, I started, I started feeling a little bit more miserable about the whole thing. I got married very young. I was maybe 22. And the way the witnesses handle marriage is it's not necessarily an arranged marriage, but it kind of is. Because there's so few people who are like, there's so few single people in the witnesses, especially single men. So what they'll do is they'll go, hey, you're a single man. There's a single sister. I think the two of you should date. And after a while, you're like, yeah, we should date. Except with dating amongst the witnesses, if you date somebody, if you don't marry them, you're kind of an a-hole. So what ends up, and you can get you can get reproved for dating somebody without marrying them because you weren't taking it seriously. And reproved is where they start kind of shaking their finger at you and maybe taking away some of your privileges in the congregation. So you're kind of locked into somebody when frankly dating is just supposed to get to know whether or not you can stand to see this person's face every morning. Or sometimes it's not even for that, it's just for fun, but they make everything a life or death matter. So I get married very young and it was miserable. We loved each other, but we didn't like each other. And
I mean, it does remind me of how you hear about arranged marriages, say in the Asian cultures where there is a strong and religiously centered kind of community, and there is a de-emphasis of individualism. It sits uncomfortably with the individualistic culture of the U.S., but I guess that just is reflected in how much you shunned outsiders and kept the youth away from the other youth.
Yeah, there's people that I was obviously interested in as a teenager or as a young adult, but I wasn't allowed to date them. If you date outside the witnesses, that gets all your privileges stripped away. And then they don't shun you yet, but they're basically saying you're at the door. You got to be careful, step back. And if you don't listen and you keep on going with that, then it kind of shows that you don't care to hear what the elders or the people who are in charge have to say.
You used a theory toward the end of your book of behavioral control, information control, thought control, and emotional control.
That is credited to Stephen Hassan. He's on Twitter. His handle is @cultexpert. So I recommend that people
a way of describing how cults work.
Exactly. Yes.
But so I mean, what kinds of things made the notion that there is this totalitarian system operating in your life, start to dawn on you? Or
I'm married and it looks on the outside like a perfectly idyllic marriage. I mean, we bought a house with literally a white picket fence, right? We had a son and everything looked good. But on the inside, it was miserable. We hated each other. I ended up a lot of times being a mentor to the youth because they seemed to like me and I felt more comfortable around them than around some of the older people who were very buttoned down. I felt a lot more comfortable. One time I happened to be with a couple of them. We're just going to the store to get some ice cream for a thing. And one of them asks me the question. They're like, hey, how come the Bible says that humanity is only 6,000 years old, but some scientific things say that humanity is hundreds of thousands of years old? I didn't have a good answer. And I was like, well, they're wrong. I didn't have a good answer. And I was like, I need to find a better answer for that for my own sake. And I started looking into carbon dating. And that's when I realized carbon dating is pretty airtight. They've been over and over and over this. They haven't stopped checking this out for a very long time. And then I'm like, oh no. Does that mean that evolution is really happened? And it's like, oh no, oh no, oh no. I started going, well, now what do I do with this? And I started realizing, like, my son, I love my son. You know, I've got a son and a daughter, and my son came first, and I loved him so much. The story I always tell him is about when he was born, his mother couldn't get to him right away. So he's on a warming table, just screaming his head off. And so I walked over to him and I said, "Hey, bud." And he stopped crying and we just locked eyes and just stared at each other. And like since then, we've been inseparable. And I would look at this little boy and I'd be like, what if one day he realizes he's gay? Because amongst the witnesses, that is a no-no. I would have to shun him. I'd have to kick him out. And I'm like, I couldn't do that to him. I love this child too much. And then I'm like, oh, then that means I'm not a very good witness. Oh no. You know, it's another bit of the wall starts to crumble.
Parenting itself just recentered your notions.
Yeah, it kind of changes. It changes your worldview because suddenly you're not just thinking about, you know, me and my own beliefs. You're thinking about me and how am I going to raise this little life that is depending on me for the rest of its life? How can I force my child to accept an ideology that I do not accept? That's just dishonest. It's dishonest and rude to do that to a child. Finally, the dam fully burst when I went to Wikipedia and looked up Jehovah's Witnesses and then scroll down to controversies. And then all of a sudden it was like, I didn't know about all of these things. I didn't know this. I didn't know that. I didn't know this. I didn't know that. And then after that, it's like, well, I can't hold it back any longer. You know, I can't pretend that this is something that I want to do. But I still really tried to pretend that it was something I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to lose my family, my friends. I didn't want to lose all of it. Right around that time, though, there was somebody else who I refer to as my exit buddy, that he was kind of going through the same stuff, that he's like, yeah, I don't really believe any of this stuff anymore, man. And I don't know. And we were kind of circling each other warily because, you know, I read a book called Escape from Camp 17 about North Korea. And there was a guy who escaped from the prison camp. And the one thing that he kept talking about is you were always afraid that someone else was going to rat you out. And that's exactly how it felt amongst the witnesses, that you were always afraid someone was going to rat you out. As time goes by, you know, we start realizing that, yeah, this is real. We're both really having these thoughts. And we would spend hours just spitballing stuff back and forth at each other and going, oh my God, I just learned this. And oh my God, I just learned this. And it was great.
Right.
But at some point, you kind of have to make a choice. I had decided that I was just going to keep quiet for as long as I could, but I was secretly sending messages to people who'd left the witnesses and just being like, hey, what's life like not as a witness? And they were like, oh my God, it's great. Things that outside of this organization, it's nothing like you've been taught. It's just fine. Things are fantastic. Whenever you're ready, you're welcome to come on out and we'll be here.
You knew strong inner conflict and very conscious awareness of what you stood to lose.
Yeah.
And just having to weigh, is it worth it?
And the decision was made for me because my ex-wife found the messages and immediately ran to the elders. So I could make two choices. I could either A, decide to stay as a witness and kind of prostrate myself and I'm so sorry, or to just go, you know what? I said what I said and I meant what I said. I don't want to do this anymore. And I said what I said. And that was the end of that. It was like leaping out into the unknown because everything you thought you knew, I had been taught since little on that people were going to eat you alive outside of the witnesses, that you were going to be it was going to be miserable. No one was going to be nice to you. People were going to take advantage of you. And next thing I know, people at my job were like, they knew I had to get an apartment. So they found me an apartment. They got me silverware. They got me pots and pans, appliances, just things for my kids, toys for them. Like it was
people at your job outside the witnesses.
It solidified my decision. Like, you know what? I made the right choice because I had never in the witnesses gotten that kind of attention. The only time I ever got attention is when I was doing a discourse on the platform or something like that, or when I did something especially Jesus-y. But the rest of the time, it was like, you're just like a poor kid who lives in government housing. I don't give a crap about you.
Amid all that uniformity, there still was not, you say, close enough like solidarity when people were in need.
There was a couple of times when I was growing up where people would do nice things for my mom. Like my mom had a car that died and somebody gave her a car, but we lived in public housing. We ate government cheese. We barely got any assistance from people who were, witnesses. But outside of the witnesses, people were generous and kind. This is what I've been looking for. People who, we have differences of opinions, but we all come together and we help each other. And that's the right way to live, as opposed to trying to fight over things. And I'm lucky enough that my kids, both have decided that they're not entirely interested in the witnesses. My son was very interested in them, and he was even like having anxiety attacks over thinking that I was going to die at Armageddon.
Sure.
And we finally had to talk about it, and I explained to him some of the stuff that's laid out in the book about the flood and about how some of this stuff isn't real. And then he was like, okay, all right, okay, I'm done.
Yeah, this younger generation, man, they're sharp.
Right. And he's like, he got it. He understood it. And because he trusts me too, he knows I'm not going to lie to him.
Right.
And my daughter, she doesn't care. My daughter is not interested at all in it. She's more interested in drawing cute little pictures and in talking about burps and farts. Honestly, it's an improvement over the witnesses.
You've just recounted far more of your own experience than you chose to put in your book about exiting the witnesses. The book, really kind of reads like the work of someone who just had some questions that really bothered him, and stuck in his craw, and he just kept working on the questions and worrying them. And like you couldn't discuss them with anyone for a long time, so they bottle up. And the emotional reality of that comes through in the vitality and sharpness of your arguments in chapter after chapter.
One of the reasons that I chose not to include a lot of my stories, because a lot of witness people, they grow up as kids, they grow up, in the organization, they decide they don't like it, but they're trapped, and then they have to make a tough choice. And it's the same story over and over. It's not a unique story amongst people who are witnesses. Everybody's dealing with the same thing. So me reiterating my story in the book, I even put it in at one point, and I'm like, no, this isn't what I want to talk about, because I'm only interested in getting into why they're wrong.
Ways that can then sit inside somebody else and grow and fester and undermine.
Exactly. People need to be able to ask those questions. And if you're not able to ask questions, if you're kept in an environment where you're not allowed to present those questions in any sort of intellectually honest way, of course you're going to end up stuck in this weird way of thinking. That's just how it works. So being able to tell people it's okay to ask questions about anything you believe, because anything you believe should withstand scrutiny.
I imagine this was a hard-won achievement, recognizing finally that the questioning is the important thing, taking your own stab because you're, an organism in and of yourself, your notion of truth. Right after the introduction to your book, you jump right into Noah and the flood. What made you want that to be, round one of this bout?
I wanted to write it kind of like kicking somebody off the cliff. You're starting to read this book. Okay, push. We're going. The reason why I wanted that to be the most important one, is because that is a very foundational belief, because it links into so many things. They keep calling back to it. They go, look, Noah preached, and therefore, since he preached, we preach. God killed everybody. Therefore, God's going to kill everybody again. Only a few people survived who did exactly what God wanted. And today, only a few people are going to, so kind of trying to bring it all, they bring it all together. So if you're able to say, no, these two things don't really match up, it's just a story, it's not real. Now it kind of undermines everything that's layered on top of it, all the stuff that they piled on top of it.
So you're saying it sort of sets the tone for the whole apocalyptic message.
Yeah,
I
the
see.
witnesses frequently refer to all the apocalypses that happen in the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Red Sea, where no Pharaoh's army is destroyed, and the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. That like they
Mhm.
talk about all this stuff as they're like, look at all these apocalypses that God has allowed to happen over and over and
Right.
over. What makes you think that God's not going to do another apocalypse? These apocalypses, they're just stories, man. You're fine. You're going to be just fine. Giving people confidence that it's okay, that you're not going to die for asking questions, because God doesn't kill people if they ask questions.
I can't reflect back to you some of what the argumentation was that you used, but you went to some nutty places just in that chapter. It was a tour de force. Like, what was it about the sloths?
Yes, sloths with little sailor outfits. That's fun. I'm keeping
You
that in
better
there.
explain it.
That one's there for me. That one's there for me. My argument there is because sloths move very slowly, and they live only in the Amazon. So how on earth would a sloth get from the Amazon to Mesopotamia in a span of 2 weeks,
To
even
get
if
on
they
the
were
ark?
even if they were moving at like 4 times the speed of a normal sloth? There's no way they could cross the ocean, swim the entire length of the ocean. There's no way they could do any of this stuff. It's just impossible. I wanted to put all the different reasons that people could go, look, this entire account is BS. You don't have to worry about it. So don't worry about it. And I wanted to give people reason after reason after reason, because it's one thing to just take one thing and pinpoint it and go, this is one reason you shouldn't believe this. But when the evidence is overwhelming, if you still believe this happened when there is overwhelming evidence to show that it didn't, then you just want it to be true because you want it to be true. Admit it. Just admit
It
it.
just seems like there's so much doubling down on particular points of theology. And you
Mhm.
said something earlier about a kind of a scientistic veneer, and I
Yeah.
kind of see that as well in how the things you're bringing up. Like, what's this thing about who gets into heaven?
Right.
144,000 people. Like, what in the world is that?
The number 144,000 is twice in the Bible in Revelation. So it's actually written out 144,000. They write it out a couple of different times. So a lot of religions have kind of glommed onto it, like this must mean something. This number must mean something. And some
Mhm.
religions have decided that 144,000 people will this, or they'll be priests, or they'll be this. And the way the witnesses teach it is that they teach, okay, 144,000 people are going to reign with God in heaven in order to be kings and priests over the earth after Armageddon. And the people who survive Armageddon are going to live on the earth, and they will live in a paradise that will be run by God and the 144,000 in heaven. To be perfectly frank, Revelation was probably written by a dude who was on so many mushrooms. And they take that and go, let's do something with this. Let's make something out. Let's take this number and make it into something significant when it isn't. It's just a number. The actual counting of things in ancient times was rare. They didn't really do counting like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and write those specific numbers down as often as we think. A lot of times numbers were just purely symbolic.
Yeah.
They go, well, there's like thousands of them. It'd be like me saying, oh yeah, there's thousands of people in my city. I don't know how many, maybe 50,000. That's basically all they were doing, is just spitting out a number that sounded good. But people don't know that unless they've actually done the research into their Bibles. And I happened to do that because I was devouring every book about the Bible, just
Mhm.
any book I could get my hands on. Even some old ones, like this one called Some Mistakes of Moses from 1890 something. It's crazy.
Mhm.
I want to say, that I have respect for all religious texts to some extent, because there's a lot of religious texts that what they're doing is they're saying, hey man, be good to each other. There's some that they're just, all they're trying to do is trying to explain the ultimate question of why is there suffering. And they come to different answers as to why is there suffering. That's all they're trying to do. But to be frank, once you start looking at it as a guidepost for living, that's when it starts getting into some really crazy territory, because we shouldn't be listening to 2,000-year-old goat herders to answer the questions that we have
At
today.
least not exclusively.
Right. I mean, sometimes some of the goat herders were right, but like not every goat herder, man.
What about these prophecies about specific historical periods in
boy.
1914 and all this?
Oh boy. The witnesses and a lot of evangelical religions look at the prophecies. There's certain things listed in the book of Daniel, in Revelation, and a lot of these evangelical religions have come to the same opinion, that these are referring to former kingdoms that ruled over the earth. And therefore, we can trust what they have to say about future kingdoms and about how eventually God is going to kill, the entire world. The most out there one is in Daniel, and it's this king of the north versus the king of the south. And it's all told kind of like a Nostradamus type prophecy, where it's kind of saying, that this one will desolate the holy place, but this one's arms will get cut short. Very florid language, very esoteric type of language. And the idea being, people at the time would have understood exactly what they're referring to. To this day, we can still kind of pick out what they were referring to. It maps to a very specific time in history. What they're all leading to is that Rome is going to be the last king, quote unquote. And then after Rome is gone, the earth will be destroyed, because the fall of Rome was a very traumatic thing. It took 250 years for it to fall apart, but it was still a big deal for a lot of folks. It was the number one power.
Certainly recentered the geopolitical order, such as it was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Great Awakening of the late 1800s, in the religious Great Awakening?
Sort of, not much.
In the 1840s through 1870s, had this huge flush, like onrush of fundamentalist preachers who taught about the end of the world, who sprung up all these different religious groups. That's where the Mormons came out of, the Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses. They started as the Bible students. They all sprung out of the same time period. And if you think about it, in our nation's history, the 1840s through the 50s, it was a violent time, bleeding
Expanding
Kansas.
frontier and the conflict over expanding slavery.
Yes. And not only that, but some of the years that happened, like I believe it was 1873. I could be wrong on that year, but 1873 was like this huge railroad strike that absolutely decimated. There was a panic of 1873, and then so everything is just going haywire. And a lot of these religious groups centered their predictions around these time periods and went, look at how much things changed. Life will never be the same. Look at how everything went wrong. And then life went on. And then they went, oh, well, we were referring to another time. And then they go to 1914, because in 1914, World War I's, the Great War strikes up, and people are going, oh man, we're going to, the world will never be the same. And then the world kept going. And then things kept happening over and over and over. And it kind of takes people and shakes them a little bit and makes them go, I need to join a group that's explaining to me what's all this about. The Jehovah's Witnesses actually had a huge growth spurt from the 1960s through about the 1980s, which you think about the 60s, the turmoil of the 60s, civil rights movement, Kennedy assassinated, Dr. King assassinated, Malcolm X assassinated, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. assassinated, just like Biafra, terrorist hostage thing. It felt like the world was ending. Nixon resigns, oil crisis, just everything feels like it's going nuts.
And the same sorts of cultural ferment that you can think of as leading to, the evangelicals turning to politics and Reagan getting elected.
Exactly. It happened to a lot of these types of groups, because a lot, like, that's why we see the real huge spike in evangelicalism in the way that evangelicals approach the world. A lot of times when there is turmoil in the world, people are trying to find a way to explain it. So circling back to the prophecies that we discussed in Daniel and those sort of things, people were seeing turmoil in the world and they're trying to figure out, how do we explain this? What's going to happen next? And they went ahead and they came up with these prophecies of, like, this king is doing this and this other king is doing this, and they're in eternal conflict, and God's going to bring an end to this. It's, once again, same old story, just endlessly retold in different, with different characters.
Right. Trying to map it using these biblical passages as, what is it, a Romana clef?
Nice turn. I like that. Romana
boy.
Clef. That's a good one. My second edition, I'll steal it.
Yeah, it does seem like limited thinking. There's so many other examples of it with real and bloody consequences. I really appreciate in the book the way you proceeded, really kind of patiently, maybe modestly is the right word, like saving the thorniest and most horrifying issues around the witnesses for the later chapters of the book. Like for the problem with blood, for example. Can you explain what that's all about?
Jehovah's Witnesses believe that blood transfusions are not allowed. And the reason for this, and it's a lot of this stuff that makes sense on its face, because the Bible says repeatedly, don't drink blood, don't eat blood. You've got to bleed animals before you eat them, because you can't eat blood, because blood is something that is only for God. Paul repeats it as well. So it's kind of like this is a through line throughout the Bible. They keep talking about blood, 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 blood. And then finally they put, Paul puts a little period on it. So the witnesses go, well, clearly blood is very important to God. Therefore, we shouldn't be eating blood. And, if people are getting these blood transfusions, well, that's sort of like breaking the rule too. If you accept the primacy of the Bible, that sort of makes sense. But then when you start picking it apart, you start realizing, well, it doesn't really make sense, because there's other things that they allow witnesses to do with the blood. They will allow witnesses to accept certain fractions of blood for transfusion or medicinal purposes, but they won't allow them to accept blood, or one of the four major components, which are platelets, white cells, red cells, and plasma. You can't do that.
This is all like trying to square a theological circle?
Yeah, you can use one of these smaller things, like albumin you can use, but you can't take platelets, which, the more you think about it, then you're like, well, wait a second. In order to get a fraction of blood, that means that more people are donating blood to get the fraction. Even more people than if you had just taken the blood in the first place.
Than whole blood.
So you're basically making more people break this primal rule of God's.
Not to mention consigning some people to death.
Right. What they do is they extend that out. And then they go, look, you're not supposed to take blood transfusions, even if your life is in danger. And then they go, if you have children and their life is in danger, you should not allow them to take blood transfusions either. And that is where one of the things I discuss in the book is that there are so many people who have died because they refuse to take blood transfusions. They absolutely refuse. Yeah. And children who did not understand the choice that they were making. They didn't understand why I'm not taking blood transfusions. They just know mom and dad told me I shouldn't be doing this. And this group that I am part of, this religious group I'm part of, says don't do it. So I'm not going to take blood, and I'm going to hold fast to this because I don't have any other frame of reference. And one of the things that they do, they have what are called hospital liaison committees, who are the congregation overseers, and they will go into the hospital and sit with the person who is in the hospital under the guise of saying, look, this
all because
person,
of this blood problem.
Well, yeah, and also to be like, you know what, this person may not necessarily be all 100% there, but we know they don't want blood. They've made it very clear.
Mm.
And if you tell the hospital liaison committee, get out, I don't need you here, you can leave, well, that is very suspicious. And it could be potentially grounds for getting questioned. And maybe you were being a little, well, this isn't a very important thing. And it's awfully suspicious that you didn't want us there. They end up killing people because of this. And if they decide to change their viewpoint on this, well, that opens up so many lawsuits. Think of all the people who have, even if they didn't die, they maybe had to undergo unnecessary treatment. Maybe they had to go, maybe they are now suffering from ailments that they wouldn't have had to. It's not like, hospitals just sort of have like a giant 55-gallon drum full of blood that they just sort of pump into everybody who walks in. Like you walk in, you get a cup of blood and you go to your room. They don't do that. They only use it when it is absolutely necessary. Children have lost their lives due to this. And that's the thing that really sticks in my craw. That was one of the things
Well, of course.
when I, with my children, when I got divorced, I said, look, the thing I want in this agreement is that anytime there's anything having to do with any sort of blood issue, I need to be the one making the call. And fortunately, that right was handed to me. But there's a lot of parents that they have to fight to tell to tell the doctors, no, save my kid, save them. You talked about backloading a lot of this stuff in the back of the book. It's because I wanted to kind of be a little lighthearted at the front, kind of like you're just sort of, okay, we're just going to kick down some of the myths, some of the things. And now that you understand that you're not going to be in trouble, you're not going to get killed for questioning these things. Okay. Now, here's the way that they treat women. The witnesses absolutely just make life miserable for women in general.
Well, and for children, you do get into
women
that.
and children.
It's just the business of the 2-witness rule in and of itself seems like enough.
So there was a big case in Australia. Australia did what is called the Royal Commission on Child Abuse. What they did is they decided to investigate every religion that they could in Australia and see how every religion handles child sexual abuse. And some of them, they said, hey, you're doing a good job. You're reporting this stuff. You're following all mandatory reporting procedures. Some of them, they said, here are some suggestions to make things better. With the Jehovah's Witnesses, they did a huge interview where it was live streamed. They actually got one of the governing body members, who is one of the big mucky mucks running the organization, to testify. And this is all available on YouTube. That if you just look up Royal Commission Jehovah's Witnesses, you'll be able to find it. And their results actually came out today, their final report. It's a 100-page report where they kind of lay out all the facts. Do the witnesses not do a good job of protecting children from child molesters? They make it actively worse, and they refuse to take any suggestions on how to make it better. One of the ways that they make everything worse is there's a thing in the Bible where it talks about how every time that there is a judicial matter. So let's say that I catch Roger sleeping with my wife. Then I'm like, oh, how dare you, Roger? If I ran and told the elders, I saw Roger sleeping with my wife, and Roger goes, I didn't sleep with his wife. And my wife goes, I didn't sleep with Roger. Well, I would need a second witness, because that way people can't just throw accusations out willy-nilly. There's 2 witnesses, and on the face, it sounds fine. It sounds like a good idea because you don't want people just throwing out accusations. But then you start thinking about it, and especially when it comes to certain matters, imagine if we kind of did that with murder. I saw that, person X kill person Y. Well, there had to be another person around. Well, either by
you could argue that we effectively have done that with rape in the whole society.
Exactly. We have, and even in cases where there's more than one victim of rape, we've made it already incredibly difficult. When women accuse somebody of rape, society demands so much from them. They not only demand just proof that the rape happened, but were you dressed provocatively? Did you do this? Did you do that? If there was somebody else who goes, yeah, I saw it, it's still very difficult to prove. And even if you prove it, Brock Peters got 3 months in probation for raping somebody in an alley. 3 months probation.
Yeah.
So adding a second sort of thing onto it of, well, there need to be 2 witnesses. We're already asking way too much of people who are victims of sexual abuse. And then when you add on to that, children, because if there's a child who has been abused, by its very nature, another child who is being abused or who is a witness is either a victim. So just adding more and more, you have to wait for 2 victims to be able to do anything about the problem. And even when there's 2 victims, they still sometimes just sort of sit on their hands and go, well, it didn't really happen. That was the hardest chapter to write. I had to take many breaks in that chapter because I would just be like, oh geez, oh boy, especially when you're researching information from Rain, and when you're learning because I have never been in this situation, so I don't know exactly how it is. But when you start researching, they have to go through so many hoops, and society just simply doesn't believe women at all, ever, about anything. That you add in the additional part of a child having to accuse an adult and having no one to back them up. If your parents try and back you up and the elders say, no, it's fine, and the parents back you up, then they're booted out of the organization.
Right. Everybody's discouraged from going, I'm sure, to the police or to, anything except keeping it in the family, in the organization.
Exactly. And if you go to the police or the authorities or any type of authority, they have this big thing about heaping reproach upon Jehovah's name, that they don't want you to make God look bad. So you can get kicked out for making God look bad when all you're doing is literally saying, hey, that guy did something terrible.
Being the messenger, right?
Yes. So, and it's funny because that concept of reproach on God's name doesn't really appear in the Bible. There isn't really, it's something that all witnesses understand. But it's not really something that, that idea of, ooh, you better not tell anybody about bad things, or, God hates you. That's not in the Bible.
Right. That seems more like a human control tool rather than a divine one.
That's sort of part and parcel to a lot of, especially evangelical religions, is that when you really double and triple down on this is what the Bible says, so we're going to stick to it. Because then you are, by your very nature, gulping down the camel, straining out the gnat. Because there's certain things in the Bible that they say you simply shouldn't do. There's certain bugs that you're not supposed to eat according to the Bible, but there's certain ones that you can eat, but the ones that are hopping you can't eat, but there's some hopping ones you can eat. When you start getting really into the weeds on this stuff, it just starts becoming onerous. When you see people who are hardcore evangelical, it's that they're trying their hardest to do what they think God wants them to do. It's this maddening chase after a ghost to do what they think God wants them to, while all the time, either believing in their heart of hearts that they are right no matter what, or being racked with self-doubt. And
cognitive dissonance,
yes,
the phrase I have for it.
It kind of whipsaws back and forth between, I am right and, oh God, I'm going to die. I'm right. Oh God, I'm going to die. It's a stressful way of living. One of the hard parts about writing any sort of introduction to the book is that I don't remember the majority of my childhood. And I didn't realize till much, much later that not remembering large swaths of your childhood is a result of trauma, which is great. It's great, and this sort of upbringing is traumatic to children.
Also, in the end, you speak about the more recent trauma that was thrown down upon you for exiting. I suppose your compensation is you can get out from under the doubts, the cognitive dissonance, all of that, but it comes at the cost of The word I learned from your book is disfellowshipping.
Disfellowshipping, yeah, and it sounds real innocuous. It
Yeah.
sounds like the nicest little word on earth, but it's shunning. And shunning hurts. Ostracism hurts. For them, it's a feature and not a bug because they want it to hurt. They want it to be that you see this person and you kind of wave at them and they look back at you and they ignore you and you're like, oh, I should go back to the witnesses where when I wave at somebody that I know, they will see me and they will wave back because it hurts. They want it to hurt. They want you to feel that pain in your heart so that you understand, quote unquote, what you've done.
Yeah, you're either in or you're out.
It's one of those things that a lot of cults do in general. You are either with us or you are against us. And if you are against us, we don't even want to look at you. They don't want to admit that what they're doing hurts, even though they know that it hurts, but as part of the cognitive dissonance. Like, no, this is loving, this is nice, even though it's hurting somebody. They might liken it to, well, sometimes you have to give your child a shot for a vaccine,
Yep.
even though it's going to hurt them.
Right.
But
or
it's
spank
not
them in the spanking room.
Or in the spanking room, yes. But that's not what this is. This is like sawing off their legs and leaving the wounds open and gaping just to teach them a lesson. That's what this is. And you can't do this to people, but they've been getting away with it for a very long time. And a lot of these beliefs are directly as a result of one or two people way back deciding to make some wacky changes because they wanted more power. And here we are. Even like the Mormons, Joseph Smith started it, and then Brigham Young kind of took it in the direction that it is today. They do that. A lot of these movements will start with one person, and then the second person jumps in and goes, okay, yes, and we'll add all this extra
and that's
stuff.
how it was with the witnesses too, right?
Exactly. It started with Charles Taz Russell, which, by the way, Taz, awesome middle name. I really wish that my middle name was Taz, but alas, it is not to be. So it started with Russell, and then he died in 1916, and then there was a big power struggle, and out of it came Joseph Rutherford, who was an attorney and just sort of a all-around jerk from really, this is a matter of historical record. The dude he was prickly and unlikable even by the standards of 1916. And the witnesses sort of admit it too. But they also are like, but he was exactly what we needed at the time, because you can't speak against the leaders if you're in a cult.
Yeah.
So, and that's sort of, and he's the one who made a lot of the changes that really kind of converted the witnesses from just sort of a fringe group and then just sort of codified it into this, we're going to do all this stuff to kind of, really squish people into a way of living. It's sad how a lot of that happens, but these are not things that are unique to the witnesses in a lot of ways. These behaviors and the way that the organization is run is not entirely unique. A lot of smaller cults work in a more or less decentralized structure, sometimes highly centralized, but they all have certain things in common. Researchers like Robert Lifton also were very early in trying to decipher some of the ideas behind some of the cults. And then obviously
was he the one who popularized the phrase cognitive dissonance?
I don't know enough to argue that point. Then you've got like Steve Hassan, who actually was part of the Moonies. Mm-hmm. And when he left the Moonies, he was like, well, how in the heck did I end up in that? And for a lot of folks, they feel like they were in a bad dream. Then when they come out of it, then they're trying to ask questions of themselves and trying to piece it together. Witnesses have some terminology that they'll use amongst themselves, ex-witnesses, I should say. Mm-hmm. But there are some people who are physically out, but mentally in. POMI, physically out, that you've been kicked out of the witnesses for being a failure, but you're still mentally trapped in there.
I see, right.
There's some that are physically in and mentally in, so PIMI, and then physically in, but mentally out. So you might be like, look, I'm stuck in here. I am
Right.
stuck in here because my family is in here. I love my wife and I can't leave the organization, or there's some reason that I can't get out of here. But I am mentally out. Being at the meetings makes me sick.
That seemed like
You
a
know,
group you were, somewhat thinking of as a prospective audience for what you wrote.
Because there are a lot of folks who are, physically in, mentally out. And it's very hard for them to find each other because it's that sort of North Korea. If I talk to this person, are they going to rat me out? I remember one time after me and my exit buddy were starting to talk, suddenly my my wife got a phone call. I was like, is Lee leaving the witnesses? And right away I was talking to my exit buddy and I'm like, dude, did you rat me out? And he's like, no, I didn't. Did you rat me out? Because somebody else was talking to me. And we were like panicking and kind of like pointing the finger a little bit, like, am I sure I can trust you? And then we realized that it was just because we both happened to be talking to each other and they knew that we were kind of starting to question things, that they were getting curious as to what was going on and if we were leaving. And then we're like, okay, neither of us is ratting the other out. Okay, I trust you, dude. We're going to be fine. That's what happens when people try and seek each other out inside the organization, because there's just no way of being able to tell the truth to somebody else without fear of being booted out or being ratted out. It's very, very
Right.
scary.
Right. The hope is that you can introduce some fresh air and create further cognitive dissonance and help people move toward that action.
And to understand that there are support groups online. There's lots of, that's been one of the big things that helped a lot of people, including myself. There is a gentleman by the name of Lloyd Evans who has been instrumental in a lot of people leaving the Jehovah's
No relation,
Witnesses.
I imagine.
No. He's British, so, and he's so I don't know, and he's probably better looking than me, anyways. He's been instrumental in a lot of folks leaving the Witnesses. There's other folks out there who have been doing some phenomenal work. I can't remember all their names, but they've been doing a great job. The way I think about it sometimes, when you're trying to keep somebody in this tight little cage and they want to get out of it, because the human soul yearns to break free.
Right.
So you've got to like weld every little joint of this tiny little cage, and you've got to double check them and triple check them. And you've got to like check every last bit of this constantly, because at any second it will break free. And all it takes is for one person just to sort of walk up and bend a piece of it, and the whole thing falls apart. That's what happens when you try and hold somebody into a certain way of belief. You can't hold them there forever. Eventually something breaks free. What some people try and do is they try and grab somebody and yank them out of the organization. They try and say, I want to help my mom or my dad or my uncle or my brother or my sister. I want to drag them out of the Witnesses. And you can't do that. It doesn't work, because we're just not built that way. If we believe something, it's really hard to break out of that. If you believe something, it is so hard to break out of that way of thinking. And one of the terrible quirks of human brains is that if you try and argue a point with someone and you present them evidence that shows that they're wrong, our stupid little pieces of wet bacon, electric bacon that's in our head, decides that I'm going to double and triple down on the idea. So, it's one of those awful quirks of having a human brain, but it's something that happens to us. So you can't.
Motivated reasoning is the phrase I've heard about it.
Yes. When we look back at, for example, some of the political cults that have sprung up,
right?
How do you deprogram all these people who have fallen into this sort of this cage of weird belief? How do you do it? And the problem is that you can't. You have to wait for them to get out, and then understand that some of them never will. Right. And you're going to have to be okay with that.
the strategy that you were following, attempting to sow seeds that may germinate into useful doubt and
Mhm.
questioning.
And sometimes those seeds land on concrete,
Yeah.
and there's nothing that can happen. It's weird that as a society, we're going to have to be okay with that. We're going to have to understand not just that that happens, but also that you can't give those people oxygen, because the more oxygen you give them, the more airtime, the more time they have to kind of tell everybody about these bizarre beliefs, then the more people start going, that seems like an interesting point of view. Let me look at that a little bit further. It's going to be necessary for us to be more educated on how these cults work.
So. And, I think the conversation that we've been having has really made clear that cult behavior is real, that it's widespread and takes different forms, and that in general, learning about one can help you recognize others.
Yeah. And one of the things to understand too is, so I've explained some of the beliefs that Jehovah's Witnesses had that are wacky, like the king of the north, king of the south. There's these wild beasts that are fighting, and there's the 144,000 going to heaven, and these beliefs that you'd be like, if somebody just on the street walked up to you and said, "Hey, did you know that 144,000 people are going to heaven?" You'd be like, get out of here. But what they're doing,
that wasn't part of your doorstep rap.
Correct. But what they do is they present people with something else. They don't walk in there with those wacky beliefs. They walk in there with hope. They walk in there with, isn't it terrible that life is this way? Don't you wish that there was something better? Well, there's a promise of something better.
Now we're talking advertising.
And that's what they're doing. And even groups like Q do the same thing. They go, boy, your life is hard, isn't it? There's a thing that's going to make your life all better when you understand that this is all a front. And now you've got people's attention, and you're sort of leading them down the primrose path until suddenly now they're believing that, that there's lizard people on the moon. It's a pipeline to people believing really messed up stuff. So there has to be a pipeline as well for people to go the other way, a pipeline for people to go, hey, I need to clear my head. I need to think about things rationally, a way to kind of lead people away from those. And that's why, services like what you guys are doing here, it's a fantastic idea. Keep sort of spreading the word about why it's important to use your head. I talked about how our brains are just 3 pounds of electric bacon. Well, it's up there. Use it, man. It's there for you to try and think carefully and understand that, you're going to be wrong sometimes, and that's okay. It is okay to be wrong. When you were a child, you were wrong about so many things. You thought that if you stepped on a crack, you would break your mother's back. You thought that the moon was made out of cheese. And now, as you are older, you realize, boy, I sure believe some wacky stuff. Well, growth doesn't stop just because you've stopped physically growing. If you're stopped mentally growing, you're just going to end up regressing into this world of, I just listen for people to tell me what to do, and the rest of the time I just sort of sit around and watch Blue Bloods. There's so much more to it than that, and a lot of that stems from the Maslow's pyramid of needs, and but
Maslow's one of the humanists.
Yeah, exactly. The idea that if people don't have their basic needs met, they're not going to question other things too hard. That's why we end up in situations where people just want somebody else to do the thinking for them because they don't have some other things met. So they're like, look, you tell me what I should believe, and then I will take your word for it. The rest of the time, I'm just going to be over here desperately trying to stay alive. There's so many more things that we need to be doing for people if we're going to ever try and get folks out of some of these strange mindsets that they're kind of stuck in.
You do say some sweet things at the end of the book, sort of some words of advice from someone who's been there, aimed at people on the precipice of exiting.
You mentioned before we started that there's a couple of paragraphs that you liked in my book, and I'm just going to kind of read those. People who are Douglas Adams fans might notice a little bit that I stole from him, but I don't think people will grudge me too much for it.
or 144,000, whichever comes first.
Oh no, oh no. I want you to think about the universe. Space is big. I mean, really, really big. For example, the great red spot on the planet Jupiter is so big that you can fit 3 Earths in it. That's huge. The sizes of the other planets in our solar system boggle the mind, and the sun is even more impossible to comprehend. Here we are, 93 million miles away from it, and it's still large enough that we can see it in the sky and feel its warmth. Even taking into account the enormity of our sun and the planets, our solar system is still about 99% empty space. Yet, the sun is only a medium-sized star. I want you to think about how many stars there are just in our galaxy. There are hundreds of billions of stars, planets, and moons surrounded by a vast, inky blackness. In the spaces between the galaxies, we find nothing but scattered icy planets adrift forever in the void. Here and there, we find dim stars that have been cast out from their galaxies and continue in search of a new home. The enormity of these empty spaces between these galaxies are impossible to comprehend in our limited brains. It's even more staggering when you consider that this is only a small part of reality. In our observable universe, there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, strung together like grand filaments with even more unfathomable empty space between them. Trillions and trillions of stars, planets, and moons doing a cosmic dance into infinity. We tend to place value on things based on their rarity. For example, gold is worth more than plastic. Plastic is common, gold is not. Think of the enormity of the cosmos and all the empty space it contains, and then consider the fact that on this rock, this tiny speck of dust in this backwater strand of the universe, is the rarest jewel of all. You. You exist nowhere else in the universe. This planet is the only place we currently know of that hosts life, and the only humans in existence are right here. Your unique collection of consciousness, the unique arrangement of your atoms, your thoughts, hopes, and dreams can be found nowhere else. You are rarer than the most precious jewel, more special than the scarcest ore. You have intrinsic value. Groups like the Witnesses and others want to take that value away from you. They want you to think that you're only important because you belong to their group. That is false. You're important because you're here. You matter because you exist. Cherish that gift, the gift of life. Treasure it because you only get it once. And once it's gone, it's gone.
That's H.J. Evans. The book is Leaving the Tower: Why the Jehovah's Witnesses Are Wrong About Just About Everything, published in 2021. Thank you, man. What a wonderful discussion.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
And thank you for watching to the end. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel or to our RSS or Spotify audio and click that bell and let people know about When Humanists Attack, and keep on questioning.